So just so that you know, tonight's webinar is being recorded. And I will turn it over to Kristin. Thank you so much, Kristin, for joining us and sharing your ideas with us today.
Awesome. Thanks, Jen, for having me. Welcome, everyone. Congratulations for making it here to Tuesday evening, at least on the East Coast, afternoon, morning, midnight, wherever you all are. It's wonderful to be able to be here with you all for the next little under an hour or so, where we're going to dive in and think about graph choice as a part of teaching our students these skills when they're working with data. And so we'll think about how the graph type that we have influences what we can interpret, or the graph type that we're using influences what we can interpret from the data, how we know which graph type to use, and how our students are learning that when they're figuring out how to make sense of data, and how we can make graphs differently. I've been dropping in the chat, and Jen will continue to drop in the chat, a link to a Google resource document that hopefully you all can get into. It's got a link to these slides if you'd like to follow along, as well as all of the questions that we're going to be going through during it. And the first one right off the bat is, so why are you here? Why have you chosen to take an hour out of your evenings or afternoons to come join us? What is it that you're hoping to gain from this session? And the best that I can in real time, I'm going to adjust to what you guys are dropping in the chat. So if you could put in the chat your responses and make sure you're responding to everyone so that we all can see what brought you here, what made it so that you would sort of pause and take an hour out to come join us here. Great. So we're interested in building agency, students' data literacy around data, things like that. There's always a time lag between asking a big question like this and then it flooding through in the chat. And let's start graphs next week. What perfect timing. That's so exciting, Sandra. Welcome. Awesome. That interpreting the everyday with our natural occurrences. Awesome. Fantastic. Thanks for sharing, everyone. So I encourage you all to participate fully, openly, and inclusively for yourself and others through the chat and the Q&A feature through this webinar. So this is not going to be a passive webinar, but we are going to actively be working back and forth through the chat and working on some things on your own end. Some of this might be review, some of this might be totally new. I just encourage you to lean into whatever learning edge you're at and be really comfortable if it feels a little raggedy and not so comfortable. And with that, recognize that we all are coming from different situations and different prior experiences and circumstances that we are teaching in with our learners right now. And so let's really make sure when we're sharing, we're using our I statements of like, well, you know, I feel this, or I think this, or my students this, as opposed to kind of general blanket statements for everybody on the webinar together. So why should we think about this? Why, when we're thinking about getting kids working with data, do we have a bend towards the graph and graph choice? Well, a lot of it comes down to is I could show and read you this. Exit this room by walking towards the living room, walk straight 6 feet, turn right, walk straight another 10 feet to the front hall, turn left, walk 3 feet and open the door, go through the door, down the steps, head left to walk 20 more feet. Now, I've already forgotten the first step in that, or I could show you this. We are remarkably visual creatures, those of us that are visually able, and we can leverage that to our advantage when we're working with data. We gain so much of a better understanding of what patterns or behaviors or trends or features might be going on in our data when we visualize it. This is why we ask kids to make graphs from their data, but sometimes it just doesn't always go the way that you're hoping to, right? So you can like put a yes in the chat if you've ever been really baffled by what your students do or do not do when they work with graphs, or if you're like just struggling to get them to like make their graphs actually fit the question that they're asking, different things like that. Tim, thanks for owning up to it. Me too. So data literacy, this was one thing that came up as you guys were dropping in the chat, sort of why are you here? One of the things we want to get is for our students to have a better understanding of data literacy, which I define based on sort of looking at a wide range of fields from learning science and cognitive science, data visualization, to distill it down into the ability to collect, organize, visualize, analyze, interpret, and share data for yourself and others to use and understand. And that is a really big definition. And that is because data literacy is to this century what numeracy and literacy were to the past 2 centuries. This is a big thing. We cannot get this done in one lesson or one unit or even in 1 year. This is a progression across K to 12. And this piece that we're talking about tonight, this graph choice and thinking about how to get our students off of the bar charts when the bar chart isn't always necessarily to their advantage for the question they have or the data they have. Not to diss bar charts, they're definitely good sometimes, just other times we can use other kinds of charts, really falls into this organize, visualize, and analyze component of the data literacy definition. And I think about it in that graphs are to data, or charts or data visualizations are to data, what goals are to soccer. You can totally play soccer without scoring any goals. It's just sort of a big component of the game is to actually score goals. You can work with data without making graphs, but it's a big part of data is making that graphs. So that in combination with the fact that we're so visually oriented, those of us who are visually able, is kind of why we're sitting here. So I want us to think about sort of context set on graph type. And what we're going to do is I put a picture of this, a screen grab of this in that shared resource document. So if you don't have it, Jen will drop the link again for that resource document in the chat to make sure everybody's able to get into that. So this is a graph that came out, I just want to call out, this was May 10th of 2020. So this was a much different time. So this is, I should put a warning here, like we're looking at COVID case counts data, but from a very different time in our country. This was a graph put out by the Georgia Department of Public Health. And in May 2020, we were enmeshed in a conversation of, could we come out of lockdown? You know, it was after Easter, could we come out and start doing things again? So the Georgia Department of Public Health put this graph out to represent the most impacted counties. I'm not from Georgia, but give a shout out in the chat if you are. Awesome. These are 5 counties around the Atlanta area in Georgia. And so it was the 5 most impacted counties over the past 15 days. And the number of cases over time was what they were trying to communicate with this graph. So what I'd like you all to do, don't put anything in the chat yet. What I'd like you to do is we're going to take about 30 seconds to look at this graph. And I want you to think of what's something you notice and what's something you wonder, like what's a question that's coming up for you. And then get ready. You can type it in the chat, but don't press enter yet. We're going to do this as a waterfall. So I'll count down from 5 when we're getting to the end of that 30 seconds. And then there'll be this cascade of folks putting in what they're noticing and wondering from this graph. Okay, so there we go. I'm going to start my timer, 30 seconds. We're going to take a look at this graph. What do you notice and what do you wonder? Okay, so type into that chat window so that everybody can see what things you notice, what things you wonder. Awesome, they're starting to come in. What did the axes represent? What's on the y-axis? It appears that Hall was really decreasing. Hall are these blue lines. The x-axis dates are not in order. Awesome, that's a great thing to notice. So that's a great thing. There are so many things that we can notice in this graph. What comes through often for many of us when we're first looking at this is that there's a pretty large decrease across these 15 days of the case counts. And then when we take a moment and we spend a little bit longer looking at it, we notice things like May 9th is over here, but May 5th is here, and May 3rd is here, and May 1st is here. So the x-axis is not in chronological order. Now, this is problematic because the graph is presented to us as a way to look at the number of cases over time. If we reorganize the data, this is a rough sketch because I don't actually have the actual data, but this is like my best guess from looking at it. This is more what the data would look like. Now, there is still a decrease in the number over here than over here, but it's not that like precipitous decline that we see in the original graph. Why they rearranged the dates, I don't actually know. But there's just, you can break convention, but there's a problem when breaking the convention leads to a different interpretation in the data. So this graph was presented as we're going to show you how things have changed over the last 15 days. So the convention is, we presume that the days will be in chronological order because that's how we experience time. And so this is a disconnect. This is where breaking that convention gets in the way with how we interpret the data. Another thing that you kind of might have been thinking about is, so we're looking at cases over time. Why are we looking at a bar chart, right? Maybe it would actually be better to look at this as a line chart. Again, time is an ordered variable in that the 28th of May had to come after the 28th of April had to come after the 27th of April. And we know, having lived through this over the last 2.5 years, that there is an aspect of how many cases there are in one day is related to how many cases there were the day previously. So maybe a line chart would actually be a better way to show it. Or maybe we'd want to adjust the bars so that they are consistently, each of the counties within each, if we wanted to go with the bar chart, are in a consistent order, as opposed to originally they put each day in descending order. So the order of the counties, those bars within each day, varies. Now, there were a lot of questions, there are a lot of decisions that went into this. I should say these data are not falsified. It's just how they visualize the data got sort of played into what interpretations we made from the data. And some of that has to do with how our eyes make sense of information. And what I want to show you, and my computer is going really slowly, is that there are these 8 gestalt principles that are at play. And in that first graph, where lots of us see like, whoa, those case counts came down really hard. This is our continuity principle playing into it, where our eyes make sense of information before and jump to meaning before we even know what we're looking at. If we were to make it a line chart, our connection principle is kicking in. We're not going to talk about this tonight because we were here to talk about graph types, but I did just want to mention there are other components that play in to how we interpret what's going on in the graphs, but just what type we actually use also influences what we can take away from the graph. Okay, so here's the next question for you all. Graph choice. If we're thinking about how do we choose what type of graph type we're going to use, what are the 3 most common graph types your students or your learners make? Drop it in the chat. And let's see where we'll get it so everybody can see. We'll see if there's any synergy across all of us here on the webinar today. Pie, yep, that's a big one. Bar, line, pie, circle. Oh, I'm seeing lots of consistency across this. Bar, line, pie, line. Yes, 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 and yes. And if you're working with older students, the other one that comes up jumps there, Tim just got it, the scatter plot is usually the one that shows up. So we've got 4 graph types that are consistently with thousands of teachers that I have talked to, and my students as well. These are the 4 graph types that they very consistently make. So we have kind of a limited number of graph types that our students go to, be it when we're asking them to make their own graphs, there's sort of this 4 that they typically pull from, or they make up graphs of their own, which is always really interesting for us when we're trying to get a sense of, is this a science concept misunderstanding? Is this a data skill gap? Like what's going on that's leading to our students to make these really unconventional graph types? There are, in fact, multiple different types of graphs that we commonly see show up in our major media outlets, across social media, as well as that are specifically called out in the next generation science standards, the Common Core math standards, and many social studies standards throughout the country. And those are these. These are the graph types that show up. So we could use this as a baseline to come from in terms of what are the graph types our students need to be familiar with when they're leaving the K-12 space, when they're going on either into the workforce or into the undergraduate, or just to pay their own electricity bills. I'll explain that reference in a moment at the end. But these are the common graph types. Now, what often happens, and I was just, this happened to me when I was learning graphs, and I did this with my 7th graders when I was in the classroom. I was taught, and I often taught my students how to make the pie chart. how to make Google Sheets make that pie chart, though it wasn't Google Sheets for me. I was like out there drawing it with a hand because, you know, Google Sheets didn't exist when I was in school. But the challenge is that that's just an executional task. And the extra challenge of that is the platforms and programs and software are always updating, which is a good thing, but they seem to always update the night between when you've prepped for the lesson and when you're actually having your students do it, right? And we don't actually use that to choose how we pick our graph types when we're working with data professionally out in the real world. What instead we do is we go based off of what is our question that we are asking from the data. And it seems like my internet is going very slow. Here we go. What are the questions? And there's 3 types of questions that we typically ask when we're working with data. Now, this is not exhaustive, but this is just what do we typically ask? We ask comparison questions. So comparing 2 or more groups. So like how many birds showed up at the feeder if there was a fake owl there or not a fake owl there? Is it same? Are they different? Is there a relationship between the number of bird seeds that we put out and the number of birds that come? Or we're looking at distributions. So we're looking at the variability of a group. So like how many different birds came across, you know, how many different robins came across one day at different times. And then we're looking at compositions, looking at how the total is proportioned into subgroups. So how many chose red versus blue of all of the bird seed? I don't know why you'd have red and blue bird seed. This is the problem with making up examples as I go. But sort of looking at those different subgroups within the total. Now, I don't know about you. My 7th graders, let alone my undergraduates that I now teach, can tell me what type of question they're asking. But what they can do is with some prompting, some nudging, they can use words to describe what they think they might see in their data. And man, this is moving slowly. So they can use things like before and after. When they're like, before we did this, I would expect this, and then after I would expect that. Or I would expect like from here to there when looking at my data. Or I would expect like this group to look like this and that group to look like that. And so what we can do is we can use these describing words to give our students, our learners, a sense of, okay, so therefore, what kind of question are we asking based on what we're expecting to see? And that helps us because that's our kind of initial cut of what types of graphs we can use or that we should pull from, sort of immediately think to pull from when looking at graphs. We can break that down into more categories. So you can make comparisons among items. So if I were looking at birds, I could look at, among items would be the different kinds of birds that I was recording information about. Whereas between variables would be, okay, I'm looking at multiple birds and I'm looking at their preference across different kinds of bird food, or their preference across different kinds of bird houses that they frequented throughout the day. So that's a between variables, because one of our variables is the birds, the species of birds, and the other variable is either the bird house or the bird seed. The among items would be within a variable across different categories within them. So for each of these, we can then take a next step down and think about, okay, then there's certain kinds of graphs we use for these and certain kinds of graphs we use for these. So are we seeing this? It's like, we're kind of, rather than here's the whole world, or here's the entire list that shows up on Google Sheets when you select all of your data, we're giving students a more narrow focus of what to look for based on what their question is of the data. And so then we can take that a next step further and we could think about, okay, so what would those graphs actually be? So I'm going to invite you to go to this link. It is linked from the resource document if you don't want to look at the screen and actually type it in. So it's in that resource document. You can click on it. I'm going to invite you to make a copy of that Google slide document that it will direct you to. And you will be able to play around with some graph tiles in there to move it around to get a sense of like, where might these different graph types exist? Remember those graph types that I was showing earlier where we had like bubble charts and pie charts and chloropleth maps and histograms and box plots, and it's totally okay if you don't know what some of those graph types are. I'm not here to test about your graphs, and you're in your own space. We can't see what you're doing in your Google slide. This is just for you. So Jen put the link to the resource document again in the chat. If you haven't had an opportunity to jump into there, jump in, take a look through, find where we're at. We're at the activity, create a graph, make a copy of the slide document. I'm going to stop talking for a minute or two so that you guys can make that copy and you can start playing around and seeing where those tiles go in that Google slide. I'm just talking while you're working on this. In that Google slide document, you'll see one slide is what I'm talking about. It's basically this blue screen, but then on the outside are all these little boxes with the different graph types for you to move around and drag and drop. And then the other slide is what I was just showing you of the types of questions, the describing words that we use for those different types of questions, and then that next tier down of the among items, between items, things like that. So you have both of those as a resource. I'm going to give you about 1 more minute to kind of play around. Make sure you've gotten a copy. If you're having trouble, getting into the document, let us know. Tim put in a great suggestion in the chat. If you're having trouble seeing the tiles around this slide that looks like this, you can either expand your browser window or you can in Google Slides zoom in. So like make the slides smaller, and then you'll be able to see them sitting around the outside of the slide, because they do sit around the outside of the actual slide within the Google Sheet. So it'll depend on your browser, if you're on a tablet or a computer, and which browser you're using, but sort of a play with your window zooming in and out, and then you'll be able to see the tiles. Tim, thanks for that great suggestion. So again, let us know if you're having trouble jumping in. I'm going to try not to talk too much so that you can play around with this. Okay, so not a ton of time to complete all of this. Yes, we will be sending you a copy of this webinar, and you've got a copy of the resource document. So we could spend the whole hour working on this activity and dissecting this apart and talking about each of these individual types of graph types. I do have a resource if you guys are interested, and I believe it's at the bottom of the resource document, but I will make sure of describing each of these types of graphs individually as to what is it, why do we use it, and how do you make it in Google Sheets, or what's the hack workaround on how to make Google Sheets work it. If you're not using Google Sheets, just drop me a note. My contact information is at the top of the resource document, and I can help you figure out how to make any of these graph types in whichever graphing program that you're actually using. Before I show you what the answers could be, quote unquote, what I want to do, what I want to do is reflect on how did it feel to think about graph choice from this perspective, from the perspective of, okay, there's a graph type. What kind of question would what kind of question would I use this graph type to answer? So think about that for a few moments and then drop your responses in the chat. Great, thanks for sharing. So it felt like work, yes. Most of us did not learn about graph types from this perspective at all. But sort of getting at that, that the graph is for a purpose, especially in our science application, or even hopefully more and more in our math applications and in our social studies applications, we use that graph to learn something, to answer a question, to get insight, to make observations across a group rather than just one number to learn from that. Okay, so this could be one way. If I had given you more time, and I just want to honor the fact that I did not give you much time at all to fill this out, but if I had given you more time, this might be what your matrix might look like. It might not, and that's totally fine as well. But this is sort of one way that we could think about it. But I think more importantly is thinking about it like this, attaching it up with what are these graph types? How do they connect to the describing words? And how do they connect to the question that we are asking? And you might notice that there are some graph types that are showing up across multiple rows here. So our scatter charts we can use as distribution questions as well as for comparison questions. And that's fine. That might be a little tricky for our learners when they're like, I like a black, I like it black and white. And like, what is my box? But at least we're providing them a sense of, yeah, but we don't use scatter chart to do composition questions, right? So we've like taken off one row and we've gone to the other. And this also brings up the like, yeah, so you need to actively be part of this. Google Sheets, Excel, Numbers, whatever program you're using does not know what you are trying to ask from your data. You actively have to participate and be a part of that. Now, what graph types we use, some of you might have noticed that I've got sort of our undergraduate, AP, upper IB students listed up here, because what graph types we use and what we expect our students to be able to make themselves differs as our students get older. And so if this was for the undergraduates, APs, and upper IB students, I need to make sure I'm in the Zoom. This is what we would expect from our high school students, so that by the end of high school, our students are comfortable and conversant making these different types of graph types. Where is this coming from? This is coming from the research of what these students across multiple different studies throughout the world, what are they cognitively able to do? Now, this might not line up with your students individually. That's okay. This gives us a benchmark of what to work towards. This is what it looks like for our middle school students. And for any of you middle school teachers out there, if you have the feeling of like, oh, they just don't get it, like, where are they coming from? This is what we're trying to get them to get to by the end of middle school. And this is where we're trying to get them to by the end of elementary school. There is a substantial difference in the number of graph types that developmentally our students are able to take on in those middle school years. So yes, there is a lot coming to you because developmentally, cognitively, they just weren't ready yet for some of those graph types previously. And so it does fall on us, either in our informal settings, in our formal settings, in the classroom, to make sure our students have an understanding of these different graph types. Now, this is an activity that you can run. You have access to the document you were just working on, as well as in the resource document is this URL where you can download each of these for the different grade levels, and you can run it as you cut out all the tiles and you have the students do it. This is the first thing I do every semester with my undergraduate students, where I teach a data visualization class. And then they've got that, and it is their reference point for the rest of the semester. Lots of the teachers that I work with in elementary, middle school, and high school do that as well. It's also a great resource to look at when they're going to create their own graphs, to figure out, okay, not just what Google Sheets thinks by default my data are trying to show, not what they suggest, or not what is the prettiest or most complicated thing, because that's what the research shows our students are often looking for. They have those common ones they pull from, and then they look for what looks most complicated that my teacher might want me to be making. Not a good way to choose a graph type. So we can use it for that as a reference. It's also a great resource to use when looking at a graph someone else has made, and think about, why are they using a box plot? Were they actually asking a distribution type question? And that's a way to build this skill of graph choice, but not when they're graphing their own data. So we can get at this skill from different angles, from different perspectives. Now, this is just one way to think about kind of which graph type to use. There are lots of graph choice charts, chart chooser, whatever you want to call it out there. If this does not resonate with you, then don't use it. Find another one. The internet is awash of these kinds of things. This just really resonated for me from my classroom experience, and I now use it with many of the teachers and schools that I work with going forward. So I just wanted to share that out. And I think this quote by Scott Bernato, who's at the Harvard Business Review, is really good. He focuses entirely on how do we use data to make decisions. And so all he does all day is look at data. And he reminds us that if one chart's the most effective, that doesn't mean that others are ineffective, right? So once we get into that right row, it's not necessarily that like one is the best and all the rest are horrible, but it gives us a starting point to pull from so that we are getting into more effective graphs to help us actually answer the questions that we're trying to answer. Okay, so if that's graph type, let's think about sort of graph method and how we're actually making our graphs, how our learners are making their graphs to think about, because that factors in to why they're often choosing the bar chart, like how we're actually having them look at it. So we're going to do another activity. In this activity, we're going to think about the question of how long do hurricanes last? So before I actually show you the data, anybody want to drop a guess in the chat of what's your guess for how long hurricanes last? And thank you for playing along in this interactive webinar. Great, Carol says 5 days. Average 4 days. I like it. Julia's throwing in the average there. Okay, we've got 4 or 5 days, 2 weeks, right? So now we're going from 4 to 14 days. Awesome, love it. Many of you have probably not thought about that, and it's definitely not hurricane season right now. But so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some data, and I would like you to look at the data, and then you need your paper and pen. Hopefully you've got something that you can grab from somewhere, and if you don't, just visualize it inside of your head. What I want you to do is I want you to make a quick sketch. So do not plot the data, but just a quick, I'm going to do a bivariate plot, and what would my variable be here, and what would my variable be here, and I want it to be a line graph. So I would kind of draw a line up. So don't worry about the scales or the axes or plotting actual data points, right? This is just a quick sketch of what variables you were using, where the variables are, and what kind of graph that you want to make. Okay, so here are the data. So these are tropical storms from 2012. And I'm going to stop talking so that you can have a moment to digest this huge amount of information that I'm sharing on the screen. And remembering our question is, how long do hurricanes last? Okay, I see that someone's raising their hand. If you could put your question in the chat or in the Q&A. Also see that my electricity just pulsed, so hopefully you all can still hear me.
You sound great, Kristin.
Okay, thanks, Jen. So Tim, you can define it if you mean in one place or across multiple places. These are the data from 2012 that this is a subset of data that we can think about using to answer that question of how long do hurricanes last? Okay, let's take about 30 more seconds. Remember, we're just doing a quick sketch. We're not plotting any of the data. Just thinking about how can we use these data to answer that question of how long do hurricanes last? Okay, so what I'd like you to do, I invite you to share in the chat, what kind of graph did you sketch or did you visualize in terms of line chart, bar chart, histogram, dot plot, pie chart? What kind of graph did you sketch or visualize? What variables were you using? There were quite a few variables, quite a lot of columns in that data set that I showed you. And that sort of gets at that, like which data did you use? What variables were you using? So if some brave folks would be willing to share out. There is no wrong answer to this question, by the way. This was a like quick look at some data to think about it. Awesome. Thank you, Carol. So we've got a line graph with month on the x-axis and number of days on the y-axis. Awesome. So Julia's got month and duration. Anybody else do something besides a line chart? No, Carol actually plotted her data. Was anybody else thinking of something different than a line? So we've got number of days on the y-axis and the hurricane number on the x-axis. I love it. The y-axis is the number of days and months on the x-axis, again from Sandra. Awesome. A histogram, fantastic. Okay, love it. So histograms, line charts, maybe there were some scatter charts in there that folks were thinking about. So oftentimes when I was working with my students, or when I'm working with teachers and their students, we'll give students a data set probably smaller than the data set that I just showed you, because that was a lot of data that I just showed you, but you're adults and I knew that you could roll with it. Hopefully I was correct. Hopefully we didn't lose anybody off from this activity. That we give them a data set and then we ask them to plot it, usually by hand, or we either give them the data set on paper. We ask them to type it into Google Sheets or Excel and then use that program to plot it out. And then it's sort of the wrangling of like, which are you copying and how to get the program to work the way that you want. And it's usually like such a battle to just get that chart down, to get it onto the paper. So what I want to do is I want to show you this data set is a small subset of a freely available data set that Tuva Labs provides. I'm not promoting, I'm not saying you need to use Tuva Labs, but I'm just saying this is a different way to think about how to make our data work. Okay, so give me 1 second. Jen, can you see the Tuva Labs interface right now?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yep.
Okay,
Looks
great.
good.
So we were thinking about how long do hurricanes last? So this data set, what we looked at, had, I think, about 20 different rows of data. This data set now has 323 rows of data within it. So we're looking at how long do they last. So we're looking at duration. So let's drag and drop that over. And within 3 seconds, I have a graph. But then we need to remember that, we're looking at storm types, and the data set that we have is for storm types. And looking at this, it looks like there's more storm types than just hurricanes. So actually we could go in here and we could easily just filter out the tropical storms and the tropical depressions so that we make sure when we're looking at this, we're only looking at our hurricanes. Now we could stop here, right? In about 20 seconds, I have plotted the data and I have filtered out the data that is not necessary, just with a few drag and drops and clicks. But what and so that's huge. That's like really different than by hand or by Google Sheets. The difference being this is a program that's specifically set up to help kids explore data. And this is the piece that I think is really important. And there are multiple programs like this out there. CodeApp is set up similarly. Data Classroom is set up similarly. So all three of these programs are classroom ready, supported for this interface. And what's nice about them is that you can quickly change it up. So we could look at, maybe we didn't want to look at the dot plot, we wanted to look at a box plot, or we wanted to look at sort of that box plot with the actual values, or maybe we wanted to actually look at a histogram. Some of you were throwing out a histogram as a way to look at this question of how long do hurricanes last. So I'm not promoting this product, but I'm just saying how we have our students interact with the data also informs and influences how they can plot with the data, or how they can make different charts, and how they can interact with those graphs and choosing those different graph types. If we're using programs that are, let me go back to my slides to share out with you. If we are using programs like Google Sheets and Excel, and Jen, if you could just confirm in a moment that you can actually see the slide.
Yep, it says graphing programs at the top.
Great. So Google Sheets and Excel are fantastic programs. They are spreadsheet programs that we have round peg squared hold over the years into graphing programs. So they're great, but they have some limitations and they've got some like wonky things going on in the background. Their defaults of their graph types are designed by people who don't think about how we make sense of data. Just my personal, mine and everybody else in the data visualization world's personal opinion about the defaults coming out of these spreadsheet programs. They're great. They're in your classrooms. Please use them. Just please know that there are other graphing programs. Like I was just showing you Tuva. I saw a great shout out in the chat for CodeApp. Data Classroom is another option. All three of these provide free access to the graphing program. Some of Data Classroom and Tuva have a premium model you have to pay to get access to some of their data sets, but the tools are free that allow students through some easier drags and drops or just clicking between different graph types without having to reorganize what this data look like in the spreadsheet to get at it. Desmos, Tinkerplots, Fathom are another great set. These are ones that might be in the schools that you're working with or within the school district that you're at, but they might be housed in the math class, in the math department. And so reach out to your colleagues and see if they have those. They, similar to Tuva, CodeApp, and Data Classroom, are set up from the user research of how we learn from data to get students and users exploring the data. And if you want to go like full on in, you can then jump up to the Tableau, Plotly, RStudio, Python, these free resources. Tableau Public is the educational resource that is free, that have more interactivity to it to making the visualizations. So just wanted to share like how we're asking our students to make the graphs also plays into the bar chart. It is far easier to look at a huge data table of data, take the average, and plot 2 bars when we're doing it by hand than it is to plot out 323 or however many hurricanes there were once I took out the tropical storms and tropical depressions, all those individual dots onto a histogram or a dot plot or things like that. And so what we're using also interplays with the type of graph type that we are working with. Okay, I've got one last sort of reflection, implication, share out, ask for you guys. So these are the 2 questions. Pick whichever question resonates for you. So how have these activities prompted you to think differently about using data visualizations in your teaching and work, specifically when it comes to like what types of graphs, that graph choice piece like that we're so focused on here today, and or how can you expand how you're using data visualizations in your teaching or work, expand how you're having your students decide what type of graph type they should use and making their graphs. So I'm going to stop talking for a few moments so that you guys can reflect without somebody talking in your ear. Tim, I see your question and I'll come back to it. I'm just going to put it in the parking lot for a moment so you guys can have an opportunity to do some reflection. Thanks for sharing, Carol. We'll take about 20 more seconds for other folks to pause and reflect. There's been a lot coming at you over the last 40 minutes. Right, so we've got encouraging students to think more about the graphs, thinking and verbalizing before diving in and actually making the graph, the asking students to decide how to plot their graph. These are all fantastic things that you guys are sharing. Seeing how certain graphs are developmentally appropriate and thinking about, we as experts are familiar with all of these graphs, but some of them conceptually are beyond kind of where our learners are thinking. And so how can we realign that so that what we're asking for them to do from the data is in check with sort of where they're at to be moving forward? That's a great point, Rita. One thing that I want to say is that is set up, those graph types are generally set up in terms of tracking developmental understanding of, the big thing is of abstract thinking and sort of how many different pieces can you have moving at once, as well as learners' conceptualization of the representation of data, that dot is an observation with characteristics or attributes or different variables that we've collected about the group of the whole. And so that was a lot of the research that went into thinking about binning those across. So a few final things to consider. There's a lot that goes into working with data, and we have spent 40 minutes talking about a component of visualizing data. If you're interested in thinking about kind of what are the other pieces and how does this tie to the other pieces, I encourage you to check out this Building Blocks for Data Literacy that my colleague Molly Schaffler and I put together, where we've built out, in essence, kind of a K-12 sort of a scope and sequence or an evolution of how do we teach these different skills to students. Again, those grade levels being kind of a rough benchmark of its building blocks. If you don't have a previous skill, you got to go back and get that one before you can keep advancing regardless of your grade level. And there are tons of books out there on data visualization. So if you are someone who loves data and wants to talk about graphs more, one, I would love to connect with you because I do too. We could totally geek out about it. And I've put a resource in the resource document, a link in the resource document to some books that I think are really helpful if you really want to dive more fully in this data visualization piece. And if you're looking for some strategy, how to help your learners make sense of data, I run an 8-week data literacy series project. It kicked off last week, but don't worry, you can join in and keep moving forward, and I can help catch you up on last week. You can attend some or multiple of the 8 weeks, and we tackle, each week tackles a common tripping point that students have. This week is actually graphing, so we'll go into even further depth than we did today about graphing and making those graphs. So I wanted to share that out with you all in case you're sort of interested in looking for more. That is an opportunity for you as well. So with that, I'm going to turn you over to Jen.
Thank you, Kristin. Really useful information. It was interesting to see Tuva. Tuva? I've never seen that before. It's awesome. I just wanted to make a shout out for citizen science because it's such a great way. I saw in the chat at least a couple of people mentioned sort of the authenticity of data being important and using real world data. And I think citizen science, collecting your own data is a great way to do that and to play with data that can sometimes be unpredictable or messy. And next slide. We've got a curriculum called Investigating Evidence that has some experiences in there around data. It's right now, we're calling it a K-12 version. It's probably written at about a middle school level. Probably in the next, hopefully 3 to 4 months, we're going to be releasing 2 versions of this, a K-5 module and a 6-12 module. So we'll do elementary and then middle and high school. So feel free to download that and then also keep your eye out for the rewrite of that coming up. Thank you, Katie, and for your work on the curriculum. I know we've got a few people in the audience who've used this curriculum, and that's a free download.
Awesome. So Tim, I want to circle back to the question that you posed earlier because I told you I'd put it in the parking lot and I wanted to make sure you know I didn't forget about it. So your question earlier was, is one better at the elementary level? And I think you were referring to those graphing programs that I was talking about, the Tuva, CodeApp, and Data Classroom. And I would say for the elementary level, I would recommend Tuva. I think it's more user-friendly. I think at the middle school level, CodeApp is CodeApp and Tuva are pretty similar, and Data Classroom's moving more and more into that middle school space. And CodeApp and Data Classroom and Tuva are all fantastic at the high school level. Tuva's got a lot of functions that are going on, a lot of features, and you just can ignore a lot of those to help them work for your elementary students. But it's the quickest that gets to the dragging and dropping, and so that's why I'd recommend that out for the elementary level students. CodeApp has the best thing that I have seen on the market in terms of helping students understand representation of data, in terms of how it connects from what the data are in your data table and how that connects into the graph. The graphing interface I find a little bit trickier to work with, but that representation piece is so phenomenal. And Jen, you're absolutely correct. CodeApp is completely free, and they've got a bunch of data sets in there. I should say all three of those sync in with the Google Suites. So if you're a Google Suite school, you can easily upload your own data. All three of them have the ability to upload your own data into it. So if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat or submit them through the Q&A feature. While I am waiting for other questions to come in, if you guys have any questions, I want to circle back to that electricity shout out that I gave earlier. So this is my electricity bill for May 2019. So this was something that I used to share early on, where I'd be like, I mean, you need to know data to pay your electricity bill. And then I got this bill where in May 2019, my electricity company was more than happy to charge me 3 times what they had charged me in May 2018, even though the outside temperature, so that's the line, double y-axis, I could like talk all day about that one. But the temperature in May 2018 and May 2019 are virtually the same. We were not running our heat, we were not running our air conditioning, yet still they charged us more than 3 times as much. And because I could look at this graph and say, something seems a little off here, I called and saved myself a ton of money because it was their error. They had read my meter wrong. And so this is what I mean. Like, we need it for our students that are doing these like great citizen science projects, that are collecting their own data, that are submitting it to awesome things like that come out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, all sorts of things like that, but also just like to exist in this world and not have to pay lots of extra money. Data are everywhere. It's really different than when we were growing up. Excellent. Jen, were there other questions that you saw come through on the chat that I'd missed? There was such awesome activity by everybody on the webinar tonight. And so there was a lot I know that I did not see as I was flying through in the last hour.
I didn't notice any questions, Kristin.
Okay, great. Well, I highly encourage you guys to reach out if you have any questions. Check out the website. My website, everything I do is part of the Creative Commons license, so please use it, adapt it. I just ask for full attribution. I've got a whole host of other events that are coming up. There's the data literacy series, as well as other professional learning opportunities that are coming. My whole thing is making it easier for you to get your students working with data, to translate what we know from the research on how we learn with data into actionable strategies that we can use in our teaching and learning environments. So Jen, thanks for posting the website link for me in the chat. My contact information's all at the top of that resource document. Thank you so much for spending an hour of your Tuesday evening or afternoon with us. I know this time is super precious and valuable, so I appreciate all of that. With that, if there are not questions that are coming in, I will turn it back to Jen if you've got anything you'd like to say to close out the webinar today.
Well, thank you so much for everybody for coming, and this was awesome, Kristin, to have you here. It's, I think, our first guest webinar, so you let us off in a big way. I appreciate your being here. We've got monthly webinars, so check them out on the Bird Sleuth K-12 site or the Cornell Lab K-12 site. We're doing a special webinar, or a particular webinar next week, which I'm excited about. Our next, I guess it's in the April webinar on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it's going to be a special hour-and-a-half webinar that's very discussion based.
Great. Well, I will stay on if folks have any other questions until the top of the hour. Thank you for your time. Thanks for all the participation. I know this webinar is a little different than some other webinars in that we got you moving and typing and downloading things. That resource document is for you. Please check it out. Jen put a bunch of great resources from the Cornell Lab K-12 space. I put some other resources for data literacy in there. I will make sure you have that resource that I referenced in terms of what is each of those common graph types and why do we use them and how to make them. I'll make sure that's in there for you. And I look forward to hearing from you all and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Kristin.